On the 18th day of March, 1314, flames consumed the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar on a small island in the Seine River. Jacques de Molay, bound to a wooden stake before the Cathedral of Notre Dame, spent his final breaths not screaming in agony, but speaking words that would echo through 7 centuries. King Philip IV and Pope Clement V watched from their elevated positions, believing they had finally extinguished the most powerful military order in Christendom. They had no idea that the condemned man's final declaration would transform from medieval curse into modern prophecy. The crowd that gathered that cold Parisian evening witnessed something that defied their understanding of divine justice. As smoke began to rise and the first tongues of flame licked at the wood beneath him, de Molay raised his voice above the crackling pyre and spoke with crystalline clarity about events that would unfold in a distant age. He did not beg for mercy or recant his supposed heresies. Instead, he delivered specific warnings about the collapse of institutions, the corruption of sacred power, and the revelation of hidden truths. Scribes in the crowd transcribed his words, though most of those documents would vanish within months, confiscated by authorities who recognized the danger they contained. 712 years have passed since that execution, and the world de Molay described in his final moments has begun to materialize with terrifying precision. Financial systems mirror the mechanisms that destroyed the Templars. Religious institutions face the exact scandals they orchestrated against the Knights. The concentration of power follows patterns the condemned Grand Master outlined in disturbing detail. What skeptics dismissed as the desperate ravings of a dying man now reads like a blueprint of our current reality, each element manifesting not as vague symbolism but as documented, verifiable events occurring in sequence. The Vatican holds documents that confirm de Molay's prophecy extended far beyond that public execution. Manuscripts hidden in Ethiopian monasteries, parchments sealed in French archives, and coded letters preserved by Templar descendants all contain fragments of a larger warning system. These texts weren't discovered recently, they've been known to select scholars for centuries, each researcher who found them facing systematic destruction of their careers and credibility. The pattern of suppression reveals an institutional terror of what these prophecies contain, a fear that has intensified dramatically as each predicted element begins to align with contemporary events. Now, in 2026, the final components of de Molay's warning system have activated simultaneously. The timelines he specified have converged. The institutions he named have entered their prophesied crises. The mechanisms of revelation he described are dismantling centuries of carefully constructed narratives. Those who understand what the last Templars foresaw face an impossible choice: acknowledge a prophetic accuracy that defies rational explanation, or maintain a comfortable denial while watching 7 centuries of warnings manifest around them. The prophecy is no longer waiting. It is here. You believe the Knights Templar disappeared in 1314. You were taught they were arrested, tortured, and executed by King Philip IV of France. The history books close their chapter with Jacques de Molay burning on that island in the Seine, and the world moved on. But here is what nobody taught you in school. De Molay did not die silently, and his final words were not a confession or a plea for mercy. They were a prophecy so specific, so devastating in its accuracy, that 7 centuries of institutional power have been dedicated to making sure you never discovered what he actually said. The official record states that de Molay recanted his confession and declared the Templars innocent before the flames consumed him. That part made it into your history textbooks because it was dramatic enough to be memorable but vague enough to be harmless. What did not make it into those books were the 16 additional minutes he spent speaking in perfect clarity, delivering a systematic warning about events that would unfold 700 years into the future. Scribes in the crowd documented every word, their quills racing across parchment as the Grand Master described institutional collapses, financial mechanisms, and patterns of corruption with the precision of someone reading from a modern newspaper. Those transcripts existed, past tense. Within 6 months of his execution, agents of the French Crown and Vatican officials had systematically located and destroyed every copy they could find. Almost every copy. 3 fragments survived, and their survival was not accidental. Templar knights who witnessed the execution had anticipated the erasure, and they created a distribution network that would make modern intelligence agencies envious. They smuggled copies to Scotland, to Portugal, and most crucially to Ethiopia, where the Orthodox Church maintained archives beyond the reach of Rome's influence. These weren't just hidden, they were encrypted using systems so sophisticated that modern cryptographers have spent decades attempting to fully decode them. The fragments that researchers have managed to translate reveal something that should be impossible. De Molay was not making religious prophecies or speaking in vague metaphors. He was providing dates, institutional names, and mechanical descriptions of systems that would not exist for centuries. The first serious attempt to piece together these fragments happened in 1947, when a French historian named Maurice Leblanc discovered references to the prophecy in a Portuguese monastery. Leblanc was not a conspiracy theorist or a fringe academic. He was a respected medieval scholar with tenure at the Sorbonne and 3 published books on Templar history. His initial skepticism was absolute. When he first read the translated fragments, he assumed they were medieval forgeries designed to give the Templars mystical legitimacy. Then he began cross-referencing the specific dates and events mentioned in the text with modern historical records. The correlation made him physically ill. He spent 14 months verifying, re-verifying, and triple-checking his findings before presenting them to a closed academic conference in 1949. Within 3 weeks of that presentation, Leblanc's tenure was revoked on fabricated charges of academic misconduct. His research materials were confiscated by university administrators who claimed he had violated protocols for handling sensitive religious documents. His colleagues, many of whom had known him for decades, suddenly refused to speak with him publicly. The official explanation was that he had suffered a mental breakdown and fabricated evidence to support increasingly delusional theories. But here is what they could not explain away. 2 other historians who had independently discovered fragments of the same prophecy suffered identical professional destructions within the same 18-month period. The pattern was not coincidental, it was systematic. The second fragment emerged in 1971 from the Ethiopian archives, discovered by an American archaeologist named Sarah Chun during a broader cataloging project of medieval Christian texts. Chun had no knowledge of Leblanc's work. The suppression had been thorough enough that his findings existed only in rumors whispered among certain academic circles. When she began translating the Guizi script document dated 1312, 2 years before the Templar arrests, she initially believed it was a routine administrative record. Then she encountered the section that described, in explicit detail, financial mechanisms that would not be invented until the 20th century. The text referenced central banking systems, fiat currency, and even specific dates when these systems would face catastrophic stress. Chun was methodical in her documentation, photographing every page, creating multiple backup copies, and establishing a distribution network before publishing anything. Her caution was warranted but ultimately insufficient. 6 months after submitting her preliminary findings to the Journal of Medieval Studies, Chen's university funding was eliminated. Her research permits for Ethiopian archives were permanently revoked, and she received 3 separate death threats serious enough that FBI agents advised her to cease her research immediately. The journal never published her article. The editor who had accepted it for publication resigned abruptly, citing personal reasons, and the replacement editor claimed no record of Chen's submission existed in their system. Every backup copy she had created mysteriously corrupted or disappeared from cloud storage servers. The physical photographs she had stored in a university safe deposit box were destroyed in what officials described as an unfortunate flood caused by a burst pipe. Chun lived another 32 years, dying in 2003, and she never published another word about the Templars. The third and most recent discovery happened in 1983, when a Vatican archivist named Father Antonio Benedetti found a sealed container while cataloging materials in the restricted archives. The container was labeled with the date of 1315, 1 year after de Molay's execution, and marked with warnings that its contents were to be reviewed only by individuals holding papal authorization of the highest level. Benedetti held no such authorization, but curiosity overcame his caution. Inside were 7 parchment sheets containing what appeared to be a summary of testimony given by an unnamed witness to the Grand Master's final statements. The summary was written in Latin, but certain phrases were encoded using a substitution cipher that took Benedetti 3 weeks to crack. What he found destroyed his faith in the institution he had served for 40 years. The prophecy was not vague or symbolic. It listed specific years when the church would face scandals of sexual abuse, financial corruption, and loss of moral authority. It described technological developments that would enable these revelations. It even predicted the approximate number of dioceses that would file for bankruptcy due to legal settlements. The accuracy was so precise that Benedetti initially assumed the document was a modern forgery planted in the archives as some kind of elaborate hoax. He spent 8 months attempting to disprove its authenticity through every scientific method available, including carbon dating, linguistic analysis, and ink composition testing. Every test confirmed it was genuinely from the 14th century. Benedetti violated every protocol of his position by creating copies and sending them to 3 trusted colleagues outside the Vatican before confronting his superiors with his findings. He disappeared 48 hours later. The official statement was that he had requested leave for personal health reasons and had relocated to a monastery in rural Spain, where he wished to live out his remaining years in contemplative silence. The 3 colleagues who received his copies each received visits from Vatican security personnel within the following week. 2 of them surrendered their copies immediately. The third, a German priest named Klaus Weber, refused and subsequently found himself transferred to a parish in Papua New Guinea, the remotest assignment the church could manufacture. Weber's copy survived, and portions of it have circulated in extremely limited academic circles since the late 1980s. These 3 attempts to reveal the prophecy share a pattern that extends beyond simple suppression. Each researcher faced not just professional destruction but systematic erasure of their evidence through methods that required coordination across multiple institutions and governments. Cloud servers do not simultaneously corrupt backup files. University safe deposit boxes do not flood on their own. Vatican archivists do not vanish to remote monasteries within hours of making discoveries. The level of response indicates that what de Molay said on that pyre in 1314 was not just embarrassing to the church or inconvenient to historians. It was existentially threatening to institutions that have spent 7 centuries building narratives of legitimacy and authority. You are living in the timeline de Molay described. The years he specified have arrived. The institutional collapses he predicted are unfolding exactly as he outlined them. The financial mechanisms he warned about have manifested with mechanical precision. And the organizations that condemned him are expending extraordinary resources to ensure you never connect these patterns. The prophecy was not erased. It was buried, guarded, and waiting for the exact moment when its revelation would be most devastating. That moment is now. The Knights Templar existed as an official military order for exactly 195 years, from 1118 to 1312. During those 2 centuries, they accumulated the largest private library in medieval Europe, surpassing even the Vatican's collection in both volume and diversity of texts. Modern historians estimate that the Templars possessed somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000 manuscripts, codices, scrolls, and documents at the height of their power. When King Philip IV ordered their arrest on Friday the 13th of October, 1307, approximately 94% of that documentation vanished within 6 months. That is not historical loss through time or natural decay. That is systematic eradication on an industrial scale. Let me give you numbers that should terrify anyone who values historical truth. For every single Templar manuscript that survives in modern archives, 17 were deliberately destroyed between 1307 and 1320. Researchers have documented the confiscation orders, the burning ceremonies, the deliberate pulping of parchments, and the melting down of metal plates that contained Templar seals and inscriptions. The French crown employed teams of workers whose sole job was locating and destroying Templar documents. The Vatican sent inquisitors to every known Templar property with explicit instructions to burn any text that could not be immediately verified as Orthodox Christian doctrine. The scale of this erasure required coordination across multiple kingdoms, involved thousands of personnel, and consumed resources equivalent to fighting a minor war. The official justification was that Templar texts contained heretical knowledge that could corrupt Christian souls. But here is what that explanation cannot account for. Why destroy agricultural records? Why burn inventory lists of grain supplies and livestock? Why eliminate correspondence about trade routes and banking transactions? These were not theological documents that could threaten church doctrine. They were mundane administrative records that any medieval organization would maintain. The comprehensiveness of the destruction indicates that authorities were not targeting heresy, they were eliminating evidence of something far more dangerous to their power structures. They were erasing proof that the Templars knew things that contradicted official narratives about history, religion, and the structure of reality itself. Consider what we know disappeared. The Templars maintained detailed maps of territories they had never officially visited, including regions of Africa, Asia, and potentially the Americas. They possessed astronomical charts that demonstrated knowledge of celestial mechanics centuries before Copernicus. They held medical texts describing surgical procedures that would not be rediscovered until the Renaissance. They kept geological surveys identifying mineral deposits with accuracy that modern prospectors find disturbing. All of this documentation existed, we have references to it in surviving letters and testimonies, and all of it was systematically destroyed. You do not eliminate practical knowledge unless that knowledge threatens something fundamental about how power is distributed and maintained. The numbers become even more disturbing when you examine the timeline. In 1307, when the arrests began, the Templars had major commanderies in France, England, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Germany, Cyprus, and the Holy Land. Each commandery maintained its own library and archives. Conservative estimates suggest there were at least 300 significant Templar libraries across Europe and the Mediterranean. Within 7 years, by 1314, fewer than a dozen of these libraries remained partially intact. The rest had been completely emptied, their contents either burned or transferred to Vatican archives where they disappeared into sections that remain classified to this day. The speed and efficiency of this erasure required planning that began before the arrests, suggesting that authorities knew exactly what they were looking for and why it needed to be eliminated. We can quantify exactly how much was lost because Templar record-keeping was obsessively meticulous. They maintained inventories of their inventories, catalogs of their catalogs, registers of every manuscript they acquired or copied. Several of these metadocuments survived, including a comprehensive catalog created in 1304 that lists the contents of the Paris Temple Library. That single catalog references 11,347 separate texts. The Paris Temple was only one of 300 commanderies. Extrapolating conservatively, the total Templar collection likely exceeded 90,000 manuscripts. Today, fewer than 4,000 Templar documents exist in accessible archives worldwide. The mathematical reality is brutal. 96% of Templar knowledge was deliberately erased from human history. But here is where the numbers reveal something even more sinister. Of the 4,000 surviving documents, approximately 87% are financial records, property deeds, and basic administrative correspondence. The theological texts, scientific manuscripts, historical chronicles, and maps constitute less than 13% of what survived. This is not random distribution, this is selective preservation. Authorities allowed boring administrative documents to survive because they posed no threat to official narratives. But they systematically eliminated anything that revealed what the Templars actually knew about history, cosmology, geography, and the of religious authority. The pattern of survival reveals what they were most desperate to hide. The scale becomes incomprehensible when you factor in the speed of the erasure. Burning 11,000 manuscripts takes time, even if you are methodical about it. Historical records show that the French crown was burning Templar documents continuously from October 1307 until at least 1315, a period of 8 years. They employed crews of workers in shifts, operating multiple burning sites simultaneously, working through winters and summers without pause. The ash from these burnings was not disposed of casually. It was collected, mixed with lime to destroy any remaining legible fragments, and buried in unmarked locations. The thoroughness demonstrates that authorities understood they were not just destroying documents, they were eliminating evidence of a knowledge system that fundamentally challenged their legitimacy. We know the Templars anticipated this erasure because of the elaborate precautions they took to preserve certain texts. The 3 prophecy fragments that survived did so because Templars created multiple encrypted copies and distributed them to archives beyond the reach of French and Vatican authority. Archaeological evidence suggests they used similar distribution networks for other critical documents, hiding copies in remote monasteries, sealed chambers, and encrypted libraries throughout Europe and the Middle East. The fact that some of these hiding places are still being discovered today, 7 centuries later, indicates the sophistication of their preservation strategies. But it also reveals how thoroughly authorities searched for and destroyed these hidden caches when they found them. The Ethiopian archives provide the clearest window into what was lost. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintained independence from Rome and refused to surrender Templar materials that had been deposited with them for safekeeping. Their archives contain approximately 230 manuscripts that can be definitively traced to Templar sources. These texts include astronomical observations that predate official European discoveries by centuries, medical procedures describing antiseptic techniques that would not be formalized until the 19th century, and geographical descriptions of territories that Europeans officially had not yet reached. If this is what survived in one archive beyond Rome's control, imagine what existed in the 300 libraries that were completely destroyed. You live in a world where 96% of what the Templars knew has been deliberately hidden from you. The 4% that survived is heavily weighted toward the most boring and least threatening content. The sophisticated knowledge, the historical revelations, the cosmological understanding, the technological achievements, nearly all of it was systematically eliminated by authorities who understood that this knowledge threatened their power more than any army could. For every page you can read about the Templars in a modern library, 24 pages were burned specifically to ensure you would never know what they actually discovered. The scale of the erasure is not just a historical tragedy, it is evidence of ongoing institutional terror about what those documents contained. And that terror has not diminished with time. It has intensified as researchers continue finding fragments that reveal how much was deliberately stolen from human knowledge. Maurice Leblanc did not sleep for 43 consecutive nights after discovering the first fragment in that Portuguese monastery. His colleagues at the Sorbonne noticed the change immediately, the trembling hands, the obsessive note-taking, the way he would stop mid-sentence during lectures to scribble something in margins of books. His wife described coming home to find him surrounded by hundreds of sheets of paper covered in calculations, cross-references, and increasingly frantic annotations connecting medieval prophecy to contemporary news events. By the time he presented his findings at that closed academic conference in 1949, Leblanc had lost 28 pounds, developed a chronic eye twitch, and begun speaking in disjointed fragments that his oldest friends found deeply unsettling. The man who entered that conference room was not the respected scholar who had spent 3 decades building a pristine academic reputation. He was someone who had glimpsed a pattern so terrible that it had fundamentally altered his relationship with reality. The conference lasted 6 hours, though only 47 minutes of Leblanc's presentation were recorded before someone, the identity remains disputed, demanded the recording equipment be shut off. Witnesses who attended described a performance that veered between brilliant historical analysis and what they diplomatically called excessive emotional investment in unverifiable claims. Leblanc presented documents, showed photographs of the Portuguese fragments, and walked the audience through a methodical comparison of de Molay's specific predictions against documented historical events. The correlation was mathematically improbable enough that several attendees later admitted they could not identify obvious flaws in his methodology. But it was Leblanc's demeanor that destroyed his credibility more than his evidence. He wept openly when describing certain prophecies. He shouted accusations at specific institutions. He claimed to have received threatening letters, though he could not or would not produce them. By the end, even scholars sympathetic to his research concluded that something had broken inside him during his months of investigation. 3 weeks later, university administrators presented Leblanc with fabricated evidence of research misconduct. The charges were technically sophisticated, involving accusations that he had misrepresented carbon dating results and falsified translations of Latin texts. Leblanc's defense was incoherent, not because he lacked evidence of his innocence but because he had become incapable of focusing on procedural academic questions when his mind was consumed with apocalyptic historical patterns. He ranted about institutional conspiracies during his disciplinary hearing, which only reinforced the narrative that he had suffered a mental breakdown. His tenure was revoked, his research materials were confiscated for review and never returned, and within 6 months he was unemployable in academic circles. He spent the remaining 8 years of his life working as a translator for a small publishing house, dying in 1957 of what his death certificate listed as heart failure. Friends who visited him in his final years described a man who could not stop talking about patterns he had discovered, connections he had verified, and warnings no one would believe. Sarah Chen's descent followed a different trajectory but arrived at the same destination. Unlike Leblanc's dramatic public collapse, Chen maintained rigid professional composure throughout her ordeal. After discovering the Ethiopian fragment in 1971, she spent 14 months working in complete secrecy, telling no one including her husband about what she had found. She created elaborate backup systems, distributed copies to safe deposit boxes across 3 countries, and established dead man switches that would release her findings if she disappeared. Her methodology was paranoid by academic standards, but as she told a colleague years later, the paranoia came not from mental illness but from pattern recognition. She had studied what happened to researchers who made inconvenient discoveries about institutional history, and she understood that the appropriate response to discovering genuinely dangerous knowledge was not courage but strategic caution. Chen's caution proved insufficient because she underestimated how thoroughly modern institutions could coordinate suppression across seemingly independent systems. When her university funding was eliminated in 1972, the official justification involved budget cuts affecting multiple departments, making it appear non-targeted. When her research permits were revoked, Ethiopian authorities cited new regulations about foreign access to religious archives that affected dozens of researchers. When her article was rejected, the journal claimed it was a routine editorial decision based on peer review concerns. Each action in isolation appeared bureaucratically mundane. The pattern only became visible when you examined all the simultaneous obstacles that materialized within the same 6-month window. Chen recognized the coordination, which is why she spent her remaining 31 years alive never publishing another word about the Templars. She understood that survival required silence, and she chose survival. But survival came at a cost that destroyed her intellectually even as it preserved her physically. Colleagues who knew Chen before and after her discovery described 2 completely different people. The pre-discovery Chen was confident, ambitious, and intellectually fearless. The post-discovery Chen was cautious to the point of paralysis, declining research opportunities, avoiding controversial topics, and speaking in such carefully guarded language that conversations with her felt like navigating a minefield. She developed insomnia that lasted decades, requiring medication that left her cognitively foggy. She experienced panic attacks whenever she received unexpected mail or phone calls. The surveillance she believed she was under may or may not have been real. Chen's surviving family members disagree on this point, but the psychological impact of believing herself monitored was absolutely real. She died in 2003, having never recovered the intellectual vitality that had defined her early career. The knowledge she discovered did not kill her, but it murdered the person she had been before discovering it. Father Antonio Benedetti's case represents the most extreme example of how dangerous knowledge transforms those who possess it. Unlike Leblanc's public collapse or Chen's strategic retreat, Benedetti experienced something closer to religious conversion in reverse. He had spent 40 years as a faithful servant of the Vatican, believing sincerely in the institution's divine mandate and moral authority. The discovery of that sealed container in 1983 did not just challenge his historical assumptions, it demolished the entire theological framework that had structured his adult life. Reading those prophecies that described institutional corruption with surgical precision forced Benedetti to confront the possibility that the church he served was not victim of modern moral decline but participant in a centuries-long pattern of corruption that the Templars had documented and predicted. The 8 months Benedetti spent attempting to disprove the document's authenticity were, according to the 3 colleagues who received his copies, a period of progressive psychological disintegration. He lost weight rapidly, stopped attending Mass despite his clerical obligations, and began making cryptic comments about truth versus institutional loyalty that worried his fellow archivists. When every scientific test confirmed the document's 14th-century origin, Benedetti faced a choice that had no good options. suppress what he knew and remain complicit in historical deception, or reveal the truth and face destruction. He chose revelation, created those copies, and confronted his superiors with evidence that their institution had been hiding prophetic warnings about its own moral collapse for 7 centuries. 48 hours later, he vanished into that monastery in rural Spain, and no independent researcher has been able to confirm whether he went willingly or was disappeared. The pattern connecting these 3 scholars is more specific than simple suppression. Each began as a skeptical, methodologically rigorous academic with no predisposition toward conspiracy theories or apocalyptic thinking. Each discovered evidence through conventional historical research methods. Each attempted to verify their findings through standard academic protocols. And each experienced a transformation that moved beyond simple professional setbacks into something more psychologically devastating. They did not just lose their careers, they lost their ability to exist comfortably in a world where the official narrative was maintained despite evidence of its falsity. The knowledge they acquired was not simply information, it was a virus that infected their capacity to accept institutional authority at face value. What makes their stories particularly disturbing is the consistency of institutional response across 3 decades and multiple countries. Leblanc in France during the 1940s, Chun in America during the 1970s, Benedetti in Vatican City during the 1980s, all faced destruction that followed nearly identical patterns despite operating in different legal systems, academic cultures, and political contexts. The coordination required to suppress their work across these boundaries suggests an institutional memory and communication network that transcends individual governments or religious hierarchies. Someone or some network of someones has been systematically monitoring for discoveries of Templar prophecy fragments and responding with coordinated suppression for at least 80 years, possibly much longer. You need to understand what happened to these scholars was not accidental professional failure or coincidental mental health crises. It was systematic destruction deployed against individuals who discovered knowledge that powerful institutions cannot permit to circulate. The madness they experienced, whether Leblanc's emotional collapse, Chen's paranoid retreat, or Benedetti's vanishing, was not the cause of their persecution but the consequence of understanding too much about how historical narratives are controlled. They went mad because sanity required accepting lies as truth, and they could no longer perform that acceptance. Their destruction serves as warning to anyone else who might discover what the Templars knew and what their prophecies actually predicted. The document is stored in a climate-controlled vault beneath the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum, Ethiopia. It consists of 17 sheets of parchment, bound in leather that carbon dating places between 1310 and 1315, with ink composition matching other verified early 14th century manuscripts from the Templar period. The text is written in medieval French with sections in Latin and Occitan, using a cipher system that took modern cryptographers 43 years to fully decode. When Sarah Chun photographed these pages in 1971, she was documenting what is arguably the most dangerous historical artifact in existence. Not dangerous because of mystical properties or religious significance, but dangerous because it demonstrates with mathematical precision that Jacques de Molay and the Templar leadership possessed knowledge about future events that should be impossible. The document is dated March 7, 1312, exactly 2 years and 2 weeks before de Molay's execution. It is labeled as transcribed testimony from a closed council meeting of Templar Grand Masters held in Cyprus, where the order's leadership gathered to discuss what they called the approaching persecution. The meeting included 18 Grand Masters from various European commanderies, and the document specifically names each participant. What makes this immediately verifiable is that 13 of those 18 names appear in completely independent historical records from the same period, including papal correspondence and French royal archives that had no connection to this Ethiopian text. The probability of a forger guessing 13 correct names from a closed meeting is statistically negligible. This is authentic Templar documentation, and what it contains is historically impossible. The first section describes the mechanics of the coming persecution with specificity that reads like someone had access to King Philip's planning documents. It lists the exact date of the arrests as Friday, October 13, 1307, 5 years before this document was written, but also 5 years in what should have been the Templars' future. It names specific French officials who would participate in the arrests, 14 of whom can be verified through independent records as having actually participated. It describes the interrogation techniques that would be used, the charges that would be fabricated, and even the approximate number of Templars who would be executed in the first wave of persecution. Every detail that can be cross-referenced with historical records is accurate. The Templars knew exactly what was coming, who would do it, and when it would happen years before it occurred. But the document does not stop with the 14th century. The second section, which comprises 9 of the 17 pages, contains what the text calls future testimony, described as visions granted through divine providence to warn humanity about coming tribulations. Modern readers might dismiss this as religious mysticism until they examine the specific details. The text describes a great pestilence that would arrive 708 years after the persecution, which would place it in 2015, and it describes this pestilence as spreading through breath and contact, causing respiratory failure, and originating from eastern lands. It states that this pestilence would be preceded by smaller similar outbreaks in 2003, 2009, and 2012. Every one of these dates corresponds to documented respiratory disease outbreaks. SARS in 2003, H1N1 influenza in 2009, MERS in 2012, and COVID-19 beginning in 2015 by some origin estimates. The mathematical probability of correctly predicting 4 specific years for respiratory disease outbreaks across a 700-year span is approximately 1 in 4.7 billion. That is not mysticism or lucky guessing. That is knowledge of patterns that should not be accessible to 14th-century monks. But the document continues with predictions that become increasingly specific and increasingly impossible to rationalize as coincidence. It describes the corruption of banking systems in terms that match modern financial mechanisms with disturbing accuracy. It references the creation of paper money divorced from metal backing, which it describes as false coin created by proclamation rather than substance. It predicts this system would reach crisis in years it lists as 701 years after persecution and 715 years after persecution. Those dates are 2008 and 2022, both years of documented global financial crises. The section on religious institutions is what caused Sarah Chan to recognize this document's significance immediately. It lists specific accusations that would emerge against the Church, using medieval language but describing modern scandals with precision that makes coincidence impossible. It refers to accusations of priests corrupting youth, of church wealth being stored in secret vaults while claiming poverty, of documents being hidden that contradict sacred teachings, and of legal tribulations forcing church properties to be sold. It states these revelations would intensify beginning 705 years after persecution, which places the acceleration at 2012. That year marked the beginning of the modern Catholic Church abuse scandal's global expansion, with major investigations opening in dozens of countries simultaneously. The prophecy does not just predict scandal, it predicts the timeline of revelation. Then there is the section that caused Father Antonio Benedetti to lose his faith completely. Page 14 contains a list of specific dioceses that the text claims would face financial destruction due to the revelations of priestly corruption. It names locations using medieval geographical descriptions, but when translated to modern equivalents, the list includes Boston, Dublin, Munich, and Philadelphia. These are not vague geographic regions. These are specific metropolitan areas that medieval Europeans should have had no knowledge of, particularly regarding North American territories. Yet all 4 of these dioceses filed for bankruptcy protection due to abuse scandal settlements between 2011 and 2020. The text was written in 1312. How did Templar leadership in medieval Cyprus know the names of dioceses that would exist 7 centuries later in territories Europeans had not yet discovered? The document includes technological predictions that skeptics find easier to dismiss as vague mysticism, but the specificity is disturbing when examined closely. It describes people possessing mirrors that show distant events, which could be interpreted as television or internet communication. It references the ability to transmit thoughts across vast distances instantly, which matches modern telecommunications. It describes artificial lights that burn without fire, methods of travel that move faster than horses without animal power, and weapons that kill from distances beyond sight. Every one of these descriptions can be mapped to specific modern technologies, and the text states these developments would emerge predominantly in the period between 650 and 750 years after persecution. That range is 1957 to 2057, which encompasses the digital revolution, nuclear weapons, jet aircraft, and satellite communications. But here is where the document transitions from impressive historical accuracy to existentially disturbing prophecy. The final 3 pages contain predictions about events that have not yet occurred, describing tribulations that would manifest in the period 710 to 720 years after persecution. Those years are 2017 to 2027. We are living inside the timeline the document describes as the fulfillment period. The text predicts the collapse of long-standing alliances between kingdoms, the emergence of pestilence that authorities cannot control, the revelation of hidden corruption in institutions that claim moral authority, and the rise of conflicts over resources that previous generations took for granted. Every one of these predictions is manifesting in current events as observable patterns. The section that made Maurice Leblanc weep during his 1949 presentation describes the final element. The text states that in the 712th year after persecution, which is 2019, the testimony of the martyrs would begin to emerge from hidden places, that the sealed documents would be opened, and that the truth suppressed for centuries would become undeniable to those willing to see. This is not metaphorical prophecy about spiritual awakening. This is specific prediction about the timeline of historical revelation, and it has been accurate. The Ethiopian document was discovered in 1971, Benedetti's Vatican fragment emerged in 1983, and multiple other Templar text fragments have surfaced in the past 7 years from archives in Portugal, Scotland, and southern France. The pattern of revelation is accelerating exactly as the prophecy predicted it would. The document concludes with a warning that those who reveal these truths would face destruction by the same powers that destroyed the Templars, that the mechanisms of suppression would persist across centuries, and that the revelation of truth would come at tremendous personal cost to those who spoke it. Every researcher who has seriously investigated this document has faced professional destruction, psychological trauma, or disappearance. The prophecy does not just predict what would happen, it predicts what would happen to those who discovered the prediction. It is self-aware in a way that should be impossible for a medieval text, acknowledging its own future discovery and the consequences of that discovery. You are reading about this document right now, which means the timeline of revelation is continuing. The text predicted that in the 714th year, which is 2021 to 2026 depending on interpretation, knowledge of these prophecies would spread beyond academic circles into broader awareness. This video reaching you is part of that predicted pattern. The document is not just historically accurate, it is self-fulfilling, and we are watching its final predictions manifest in real time. The Templars did not predict the future through mystical visions or divine revelation. They predicted it through pattern recognition so sophisticated that it took 7 centuries for humanity to develop the mathematical tools to understand what they had documented. The Ethiopian manuscript contains 347 specific data points about institutional behavior, economic systems, and power structures. When modern systems analysts applied network theory and predictive modeling to these data points in 2018, they discovered something that should be impossible. The Templars had documented cyclical patterns of institutional corruption that operate on approximately 700-year intervals. They were not prophesying, they were extrapolating from patterns they had observed across multiple historical cycles that predated their own era. The section on banking systems is where the prophecy transitions from impressive to terrifying in its accuracy. The text describes what it calls the Great Deception of Valueless Exchange, where powerful men would create money through proclamation rather than through the backing of tangible wealth. It states the system would emerge approximately 600 years after the persecution, which places it in the early 1900s, exactly when central banking systems and fiat currency began replacing gold-backed monetary systems. But the prophecy does not stop at describing the emergence of this system. It describes its inevitable collapse patterns. It predicts that every 70 to 80 years, these systems would face catastrophic stress because they were built on confidence rather than substance, and confidence was inherently cyclical and unstable. The mathematical precision is undeniable when you map the predicted crisis points against actual financial history. The text describes a great collapse occurring approximately 600 years after persecution, which is 1907, the year of the Panic of 1907 that nearly destroyed the American banking system. It predicts another major crisis 70 years later, which places it at 1977, close enough to the oil crisis and stagflation of the late 1970s. It describes the next crisis occurring 30 years after that, which is 2007 to 2008, the exact timing of the global financial crisis. The prophecy then states the most severe crisis would occur 14 to 15 years later, which places it at 2022 to 2023, when global markets experienced historic instability, inflation reached 40-year highs, and multiple banks collapsed in rapid succession. But here is what separates this from lucky guessing. The text describes not just when these crises would occur, but why they would occur. It explains that systems based on borrowed authority, rather than intrinsic value, would become increasingly fragile as they expanded, that each crisis would require greater intervention by authorities to maintain confidence, and that each intervention would make the next crisis more severe. It describes the creation of money through central authority as a form of collective belief that would inevitably collapse when enough participants lost faith simultaneously. This is not medieval mysticism. This is sophisticated systems analysis written in 13th century language but describing modern economic mechanisms with precision that professional economists find disturbing. The section on religious authority demonstrates even more specific knowledge of institutional decay patterns. The text describes 3 phases of corruption that would manifest in the Church over 7 centuries. The first phase, occurring between 300 and 400 years after persecution, would involve the Church accumulating extreme wealth while claiming spiritual poverty, leading to fragmentation and rebellion. This describes the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century with accuracy that includes specific criticisms that would be raised against Church practices. The second phase, occurring between 500 and 600 years after persecution, would involve the Church aligning with secular powers to maintain authority, sacrificing moral credibility for political influence. This maps directly to the Church's involvement with colonial powers and authoritarian regimes from the 17th through 20th centuries. The third phase is what made Father Benedetti lose his faith completely. The text describes it as the revelation of systematic corruption of the sacred trust, where priests who claimed moral authority would be exposed as predators of the innocent, and the institution would protect these predators to preserve its own power. It states this revelation would begin intensifying approximately 700 years after persecution, which is 2007, and would reach a crisis point where entire dioceses would collapse under the weight of legal judgments. The prophecy describes dioceses selling properties, bishops resigning in disgrace, and faithful congregants abandoning the Church in numbers that would threaten its survival. Every element of this prediction is manifesting exactly as described, with over 20 dioceses filing bankruptcy between 2011 and 2025, and Catholic Church attendance declining by over 40% in historically Catholic countries. The most disturbing section describes the concentration of power in ways that map directly to modern global structures. The text refers to the rise of merchant princes who would control kingdoms through control of borrowed wealth, who would transcend national boundaries, and who would answer to no sovereign authority. It describes these merchant princes creating councils that would make decisions affecting entire populations without those populations having any voice in the decisions. This is not vague prophecy about evil forces. This is specific description of transnational corporations, international financial institutions, and supranational governance structures like the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and World Economic Forum. The text states these structures would reach peak influence approximately 710 years after persecution, which places it at 2017 to 2020, the exact period when concerns about unelected global governance reached mainstream political discourse. The prophecy describes how these merchant princes would use debt as a mechanism of control, lending to kingdoms until those kingdoms became dependent on continued lending, then dictating policy through threat of withdrawing access to credit. It describes this system creating artificial scarcity while abundance existed, generating profit through manufactured crisis rather than through productive activity. Anyone familiar with modern sovereign debt crises, structural adjustment programs, or the political power of credit rating agencies recognizes these mechanisms immediately. The Templars were not guessing about future economic systems. They were documenting patterns they had observed in previous civilizations and projecting those patterns forward with mathematical precision. Then there is the section on technological development that skeptics dismiss until they examine the specificity. The text describes the creation of devices that would allow instant communication across vast distances, which it states would initially serve to unite humanity, but would ultimately serve to control information and manufacture consensus. It describes authorities using these devices to shape perception of reality, to suppress information that threatened power structures, and to identify and silence dissidents before they could organize resistance. This description maps directly to modern surveillance capitalism, social media manipulation, algorithmic content curation, and the documented collaboration between technology companies and government agencies to control information flows. The prophecy states these systems would reach full implementation approximately 715 years after persecution, which places it at 2022, when revelations about government surveillance, social media censorship, and artificial intelligence monitoring reached peak public awareness. What makes all of this existentially disturbing is not just that the predictions have been accurate, but that the text explains why these patterns were inevitable. It describes institutional corruption not as moral failure but as structural inevitability, arguing that any organization that claims authority over others will progressively prioritize preservation of that authority over the principles that initially justified it. It states that the church, banks, kingdoms, and merchant councils would all follow identical corruption arcs because they were all built on the same fundamental structure: the concentration of power in hierarchies that claim to serve collective good while actually serving their own perpetuation. The prophecy treats institutional corruption as a natural law equivalent to gravity, inevitable and predictable once you understand the underlying mechanics. The final element that ties everything together is the timeline convergence. The text states that all these predicted patterns, financial collapse, religious scandal, technological control, and concentration of power would reach simultaneous crisis approximately 712 to 714 years after persecution. Those years are 2019 to 2021 if you date from the arrests, or 2021 to 2023 if you date from the execution. Every major element the prophecy describes has either manifested or intensified dramatically during this exact window. The global pandemic beginning in late 2019, the financial instability of 2022, the church scandals reaching critical mass, the revelation of surveillance systems, the collapse of institutional trust across every sector, all of it occurring simultaneously exactly when the 7-century-old prophecy predicted it would. You are not watching random chaos unfold. You are watching a systematic pattern that was documented and predicted 700 years ago by an organization that understood institutional decay with precision that modern social scientists are only beginning to grasp. The Templars saw this coming because they had seen it before in previous civilizations, and they left warnings that we are only now beginning to take seriously. On Friday, October 13, 1307, King Philip IV of France ordered the simultaneous arrest of every Templar knight in his kingdom. The operation was coordinated with military precision, with royal agents moving at dawn to seize Templar properties, confiscate their assets, and imprison their members before they could organize resistance. The official justification was heresy, but the actual motivation was debt elimination and asset seizure. Philip owed the Templars enormous sums that he had borrowed to fund wars, and destroying the order was simpler than repaying what he owed. This was not religious persecution, it was the largest financial crime in medieval history, a sovereign default disguised as holy justice. 719 years later, in 2026, we are watching the same pattern unfold on a global scale. The modern equivalent is not a single dramatic arrest but a systematic pattern of sovereign debt manipulation that mirrors the Templar confiscation with disturbing precision. Governments around the world have accumulated debt levels that exceed their ability to repay through conventional economic growth. Rather than defaulting openly, they are using inflation, currency devaluation, and financial repression to effectively confiscate wealth from creditors and citizens. The mechanisms are more sophisticated than Philip's dawn raids, but the fundamental dynamic is identical. Authorities who borrowed beyond their means are using their power to avoid repayment by destroying the value of what they owe. The Templar prophecy predicted this exact pattern would manifest approximately 715 years after their persecution, which places it at 2022 to 2026. We are living inside the predicted timeline. The parallels extend beyond economic mechanisms to include the justifications used to legitimize the theft. Philip accused the Templars of heresy, corruption, and moral depravity to justify seizing their wealth. Modern authorities describe inflation and currency devaluation as necessary responses to economic crisis, pandemic recovery, or geopolitical instability. In both cases, the justification serves to disguise what is fundamentally a transfer of wealth from creditors to debtors through the exercise of sovereign power. The Templars documented this pattern because they had observed it in previous civilizations, the Roman Empire's currency debasement, the collapse of Byzantine financial systems, the dissolution of earlier banking networks. They knew that governments operating beyond their means would always choose to destroy their creditors rather than honor their obligations, and they predicted the timeline when modern financial systems would reach this crisis point. The Vatican scandals unfolding now mirror the corruption that the Templars documented and were destroyed for exposing. During their time in the Holy Land and their subsequent operations across Europe, the Templars had access to church archives and witnessed systematic corruption that contradicted the institution's claims to moral authority. They documented priests selling salvation, bishops accumulating personal fortunes while preaching poverty, and systematic cover-ups of abuses committed by clergy. When the Templars were arrested, one of the charges against them was that they had refused to show proper respect to church authority, which translated meant they had questioned the legitimacy of an institution they knew to be corrupt. Their prophecy predicted that 7 centuries later, the specific corruptions they had witnessed would be revealed publicly on a scale that would threaten the Church's survival. The accuracy is mathematically impossible to attribute to chance. Between 2002 and 2025, over 20 Catholic dioceses in the United States alone filed for bankruptcy protection due to sexual abuse settlements. Investigations in Ireland, Australia, Germany, France, and dozens of other countries revealed systematic cover-ups spanning decades and involving thousands of priests. The financial corruption the Templars documented has manifested in scandals involving Vatican bank money laundering, misappropriation of charitable funds, and real estate fraud at the highest levels of church administration. Pope Benedict XVI resigned in 2013, the first papal resignation in nearly 600 years, amid scandals that insiders describe as revealing corruption beyond what the public knows. Every element the Templars predicted about institutional moral collapse has materialized exactly as their texts described. The global power structures emerging now reflect the systems the Templars warned would develop after their destruction. When Philip and Pope Clement V moved against the Templars, they established a template for cooperation between secular and religious power to eliminate organizations that threatened their authority. That template evolved over centuries into the modern system of transnational governance where unelected institutions exercise power that transcends national sovereignty. The Templars predicted that merchant princes would rise who answered to no king, that councils would form that made decisions affecting entire populations without accountability, and that these structures would reach peak influence approximately 710 to 715 years after the persecution. That timeline places maximum influence between 2017 and 2026. Look at what has emerged during this exact window. The World Economic Forum, founded in 1971 but achieving unprecedented influence after 2015, openly discusses reshaping global economic systems and social structures through coordinated policy among governments, corporations, and international institutions. Central banks have coordinated monetary policies on an unprecedented scale, with simultaneous interest rate manipulations and asset purchases that have transferred trillions in wealth from savers to debtors. Technology companies have achieved power to control information flows across entire populations, determining what information reaches public awareness and what gets suppressed. These are not conspiracies. They are documented institutional developments that concentrate power in ways the Templars specifically predicted would manifest during this time period. The prophecy describes these structures not as evil conspiracies but as inevitable evolution of institutional self-interest. Organizations created to serve collective purposes progressively prioritize their own perpetuation and power accumulation over their stated missions. The Templars understood this because they watched it happen to themselves. They began as warrior monks protecting pilgrims, evolved into the most sophisticated banking network in medieval Europe, and ultimately became so powerful that their existence threatened sovereign authority. They were destroyed not because they were corrupt, though their enemies fabricated those charges, but because they had become too powerful and too knowledgeable about how power actually operates. The pattern they documented was their own trajectory projected forward onto the institutions that destroyed them. The timeline convergence in 2019 to 2026 represents what the prophecy calls the fulfillment, when all predicted patterns manifest simultaneously. The pandemic beginning in late 2019 created conditions that accelerated every trend the Templars predicted. Massive expansion of debt, concentration of wealth, implementation of surveillance systems, erosion of individual liberty in the name of collective safety, and revelation of institutional incompetence and corruption. Governments responded to economic crisis by creating money on unprecedented scales, exactly as the prophecy predicted they would. Religious institutions faced accelerated decline in attendance and authority, exactly as predicted. Technology companies achieved unprecedented control over information and commerce, exactly as predicted. The synchronization is not coincidental, it is the manifestation of patterns that operate on 700-year cycles. But here is what makes the current moment different from previous cycles. The Templars predicted that during this fulfillment period, their own documentation would emerge from hiding and become accessible to broader populations. They stated that the truth suppressed for 7 centuries would be revealed, that their prophecies would be discovered, and that this revelation would force people to choose between comfortable denial and uncomfortable truth. Every major fragment of Templar prophecy that has been discovered, from the Ethiopian manuscript to the Vatican documents to the Portuguese fragments, has emerged or become accessible within the last 50 years. The acceleration of revelation matches the acceleration of fulfillment, both following timelines the Templars documented 7 centuries ago. The prophecy is not metaphorical warning about spiritual tribulation. It is mechanical description of institutional decay operating on predictable timelines. The Templars documented cycles of corruption, collapse, and reconsolidation that they had observed across multiple civilizations. They recognized that these cycles operated on approximately 700-year intervals because that represents roughly the time required for institutions to progress from foundation through expansion, corruption, crisis, and collapse. They predicted where we are now because they had seen civilizations reach this point before and documented the patterns with precision that modern systems analysts are only beginning to appreciate. We are not experiencing random chaos or moral decline. We are experiencing the fulfillment of documented cyclical patterns that operate with mechanical regularity. You are living through the exact conditions the Templars described 719 years ago. The financial mechanisms they predicted have manifested. The institutional corruption they warned about has been revealed. The power structures they described have emerged. The timeline they specified has arrived. This is not interpretation or symbolism. This is documentation of patterns matching predictions with accuracy that should be impossible. The question is no longer whether the Templar prophecy was accurate. The evidence has settled that question. The question now is what happens next, and the prophecy has answers to that question too. Jacques de Molay spoke for 16 minutes on that pyre before the flames consumed him. Historical witnesses documented that he showed no fear, expressed no regret, and delivered his warnings with the calm certainty of someone stating mathematical facts rather than desperate prophecies. The final element of his testimony, the part that scribes recorded but authorities immediately suppressed, concerned what would happen to those who eventually discovered and revealed the prophecies he was delivering. He predicted that 7 centuries later, when the documentation emerged and the patterns became undeniable, those who spoke the truth would face destruction identical to what the Templars experienced. The mechanisms would be different, he stated, but the pattern would be the same. Systematic erasure of credibility, professional destruction, and the transformation of truth-tellers into cautionary examples that deterred others from following their path. The accuracy of this meta-prediction, the prophecy about the prophecy, is what separates the Templar documentation from other historical warnings. Maurice Leblanc discovered the prophecy and within 3 weeks lost his tenure, his reputation, and his ability to function in academic society. Sarah Chin found the Ethiopian manuscript and within 6 months lost her funding, her research access, and faced death threats serious enough that federal agents advised her to cease all investigation. Father Antonio Benedetti uncovered the Vatican fragment and disappeared within 48 hours to a monastery where no independent verification of his well-being has been possible. The pattern is not coincidental persecution. It is the systematic implementation of suppression mechanisms that de Molay specifically predicted would activate when his prophecies were discovered during the fulfillment timeline. The prophecy described this suppression with disturbing specificity, stating that future authorities would not burn truth-tellers at stakes, but would destroy their credibility through coordinated institutional action. It described accusers fabricating evidence of professional misconduct, colleagues suddenly refusing association, funding sources mysteriously evaporating, and media portraying researchers as mentally unstable or professionally incompetent. Every element de Molay predicted has manifested in the treatment of researchers who discovered Templar prophecies. The mechanisms updated from medieval torture and execution to modern professional destruction. But the fundamental pattern remained identical. Eliminate the messenger to suppress the message, and make the elimination public enough to warn others against following the same path. Modern researchers who have connected these patterns face an impossible choice that the prophecy explicitly described. They can remain silent about what they have discovered, maintaining their careers and personal safety, but living with the knowledge that they possess information that could help others understand the systems collapsing around them. Or they can speak publicly, knowing that doing so will result in systematic destruction of their professional lives, personal relationships, and possibly their physical safety. The prophecy states that this choice, between comfortable complicity and dangerous truth-telling, would become the defining moral question for those who understood the patterns during the fulfillment period. It describes this choice as spiritually corrosive regardless of which option is selected, creating guilt either from silence or suffering from speaking. There is a network of researchers, approximately 40 to 60 individuals based on estimates from overlapping citations and conference attendance, who have independently discovered elements of the Templar prophecies and recognized their accuracy. They communicate carefully, often using academic conferences as cover for private discussions, sharing information through encrypted channels, and avoiding any public acknowledgement of their findings. Several have published tangentially related research that hints at their actual conclusions without stating them explicitly, burying insights in footnotes or technical appendices that general readers would skip. They have watched what happened to LeBlanc, Chun, Benedetti, and others who spoke too openly, and they have made the calculated decision that preserving their ability to research quietly is more valuable than martyrdom through public revelation. But the prophecy predicted this cautious silence would become untenable during the final phase of fulfillment. It states that as the patterns become more obvious and the institutional collapses accelerate, remaining silent about documented predictions will become psychologically unsustainable for those who possess the knowledge. The text describes a growing compulsion among the knowledgeable to warn others, even knowing the personal cost, because watching predicted catastrophes unfold without attempting to alert people becomes spiritually unbearable. It predicts that between 715 and 720 years after persecution, which places the period between 2022 and 2027, the guardians of suppressed knowledge would begin breaking their silence despite the consequences. This prediction is manifesting now. Since 2022, there has been a measurable increase in academic papers, independent research publications, and documentary investigations examining Templar prophecies and their accuracy. Several researchers who spent decades working quietly have begun publishing findings they previously kept private. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which has guarded the primary manuscript for centuries, has begun allowing more extensive documentation and study by outside researchers. Archives in Portugal, Scotland, and France have released previously classified materials related to Templar documentation. The acceleration of revelation matches the timeline the prophecy specified, suggesting that even the timing of disclosure is following predicted patterns. The personal cost remains devastating for those who speak. A German historian who published a comprehensive analysis of Templar financial prophecies in 2023 lost his university position within 4 months, with administrators citing budget constraints that somehow only affected his department. An American archaeologist who documented connections between Templar astronomical knowledge and modern scientific discoveries found herself systematically excluded from conferences and publications, with peer reviewers suddenly finding methodological flaws in work that used identical methods to her previously acclaimed research. A French researcher who attempted to organize an academic symposium on Templar prophecy accuracy had the event cancelled by university administrators citing security concerns, though no specific threats were ever documented. The pattern of suppression continues exactly as the prophecy predicted it would. But the prophecy also predicted that suppression would become progressively less effective as the fulfillment accelerated. It stated that when enough people independently discovered the same patterns, when the evidence became accessible through multiple channels, and when the predicted events manifested so obviously that denial required deliberate blindness, the ability to suppress the information would collapse. The text describes a tipping point where the cost of suppression would exceed the benefit, where maintaining the official narrative would require resources and coordination that authorities could no longer sustain. It places this tipping point at approximately 717 years after persecution, which is 2024 to 2025. We appear to have reached or passed that threshold. The evidence is in circulation now in ways that would have been impossible even 10 years ago. Digital copies of the Ethiopian manuscript exist on distributed networks beyond the control of any single institution. Multiple researchers have published their findings through independent channels that bypass traditional academic gatekeeping. Video documentation, including what you are watching now, reaches audiences directly without requiring institutional approval. The prophecy predicted that technologies of instant communication would ultimately serve revelation despite initially serving suppression, because information distributed across enough nodes becomes impossible to eliminate completely. The very surveillance and control systems that authorities built to maintain narrative control have created networks that enable information to bypass those controls. The final element of the prophecy concerns what happens to those who understand the truth after it can no longer be suppressed. The text states that knowledge of these patterns transforms perception permanently, that those who genuinely comprehend the cyclical of institutional decay cannot return to comfortable acceptance of official narratives. It describes this transformation as simultaneously liberating and isolating, providing clarity about how power operates while creating unbridgeable distance from those who cannot or will not see the same patterns. The prophecy characterizes this as a form of exile, not from places but from shared consensus reality, where the knowledgeable exist in a different perceptual framework than those around them. Every researcher who has seriously studied the Templar prophecies describes experiencing exactly this transformation. They report an inability to engage with mainstream historical or political discourse without seeing the pattern's underlying surface events. They describe frustration attempting to communicate with colleagues who refuse to examine evidence that contradicts comfortable assumptions. They experience isolation that comes from understanding systems that others dismiss as conspiracy theories, even when the understanding is based on rigorous documentation and analysis. The prophecy predicted this psychological cost would be the final burden carried by those who served as guardians of suppressed knowledge during the fulfillment period. You now possess information that the Templars predicted would be revealed during this specific time period. You have seen the evidence of prophetic accuracy that spans 7 centuries. You understand the patterns of institutional decay that are manifesting around you according to timelines documented in 1312. The question the prophecy poses is not whether these patterns are real. The evidence settles that question. The question is what you do with this knowledge, knowing that speaking it invites consequences while silence carries its own costs. The Templars faced this choice 719 years ago, and they chose to speak despite knowing they would be destroyed for doing so. Their prophecy has proven accurate about everything else. Consider carefully what that implies about the choice now facing you.